What's going on? Welcome to a new YouTube video. Today I'm going to be taking you through the process of how I actually set up an initial training program for a powerlifter. So just designing a powerlifting training split. So there's a few different steps I go through, and I'm going to show you exactly here in the video the process behind it, and maybe it can help you guys out when you're setting up your own programming. So the first thing I do when I have a new lifter come to me is I need to determine their frequency. So how many times per week they're going to train. The way I do that is by going through a training history with them. So I'll have a look over their previous programming. I'll request to look at their training information just so I can see how much training they actually need to do to make progress. So then when I have determined how many times per week they actually need to train, I then kind of split these competition lifts into slots. So if I have someone training 3 times a week, I will use 9 slots for the competition lifts. This is just kind of a default I've just used over the years. I know Mike Tuchscherer at Reactive Training Systems uses a similar approach. That's kind of where I got the idea from. If the individual is going to train 3 times a week, I'll have these 9 slots here. If they're going to train 4 times a week, then I'll have 12 slots, obviously an extra 3 to account for that extra training day. This is my usual kind of preference, so 3 slots for the squat, 4 for the bench, 2 for the deadlift. Just from my experience, I've found that people tend to respond best to squatting 2 or 3 times a week, benching 3 to 4, and deadlifting twice per week, usually, maybe with some kind of like hamstring isolation type work. And again, if they're training 4 times a week, I'll have 4 squat slots. Now this doesn't necessarily mean it will be squatting with a bar on their back, but it's just going to be some kind of squat assistance work. So it might even be a leg press or something like that. Bench press stays at 4 times, deadlift at twice per week. So yeah, I first determine frequency, and then I kind of spread that frequency over these 9 to 12 slots, depending on how many times a week they're actually going to train. So once we've got an idea of frequency, how many times per week the person's actually going to train, then I will design an ideal split for each of the 3 lifts. So first off, you can see down here these tabs. I'm going to design 1 split for the squat, 1 for the bench, 1 for the deadlift, and then I'll put them all together into one final split. Might have to make some compromises and move things about, but so let's say we had a person training 4 days a week, and they're going to be squatting on 3 of those days. So just ideally to spread the work out and to avoid kind of fatigue, overlapping and that kind of thing, I've decided for this person that they're going to squat their priority squat on a Monday, their second squat on a Thursday, and their third on a Saturday. So that would be their split for the squat. Then if you go onto the bench, I've got them on a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. The deadlift I've put on a Tuesday and a Friday. So this would be the kind of ideal scenario for each of those 3 lifts if they were just using that lift in isolation, if that makes sense. Then what I do is I take these 3 splits and I'm going to put them together into one overall split. Now you can see I had to make some compromises and shift things around a little bit. So squat 1 and bench 1 are on Monday, so that was ideal based on these that we designed. Tuesday, deadlift 1, bench 2. So I think bench had to, actually no, bench was the same. Wednesday, rest. Thursday is squat 2 and bench 3. And now you can see on these bench and deadlift splits, we had bench 4, deadlift 2 on a Friday. But to compromise, I've shifted those to a Saturday, made it an SBD day. So they get the Friday to rest, just so they get a bit of a break between that squat 2 and squat 3. Just gives fatigue a little bit of a chance to die down, because squatting 2 days back to back I think would be a little bit too much. Yeah, and then this would be the split that the person is going to follow. So you've got Monday is their 2 kind of priority slots for the squat and the bench, and then Tuesday would be the deadlift. You could even swap that deadlift to this SBD day here, just if you wanted to be a bit fresher for the competition deadlift. But yeah, there are a million ways you can go about setting this up. It really just depends on the individual, how many times a week they need to train each lift, and just what they respond well to. And obviously over time, as you kind of assess their response to this training split, you'll be able to see what needs to be moved around. For example, my own training split looks very, very different to the training splits I use for my clients. So for myself, I'm not a great squatter, and I found that squatting very frequently and minimizing the days in between my squat exposures seems to work really, really well for me. So oftentimes I'll be low bar squatting 3 to 4 times a week, and that's when I've seen the best progress. Whereas for most of my clients, 3 times is usually the highest I tend to go. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of the process of how I go about setting up an initial training program. So just to recap that a little bit before we carry on. First off, I go through the client's training history, their previous programming, their preferences, goals and things like that, and I determine how many times a week they actually need to train to make progress. Usually I'd prefer someone to be on lower frequency before they go up to higher frequency. Just because if you start out on the high end, so for example, if you start straight away training 4 days a week, 5, even 6 days a week, like where do you go from there once progress slows down? So you can't just keep adding training days forever. So yeah, frequency. Then I distribute these slots through the week. So if it's 3 times a week, 9 slots. If it's 4 times a week, 12 slots. This is just a template here. This doesn't have to be like set in stone. You could have 4 slots for the squat and only 1 for the deadlift, or you could have 3 for the deadlift and only 2 for the squat. It really just depends on the lifter, and you're going to have to play around with it depending on goals and what the person wants out of their training. So yeah, frequency, slots. Then I design a perfect or an ideal split for each of the 3 lifts, and then once I've got that, I put those splits together into one overall training split, making a few compromises here and there just to fit things together nicely. So once you come to this and you've got a split, I would run it for a block and then make adjustments, obviously based on how you or your client or whoever it is responds. So if you find that maybe this deadlift here is affected too much by your primary squat on day 1, you might want to consider swapping it with deadlift 2 here, or you might want to have this as your 3rd squat slot, for example. So yeah, you're just going to need to play around with it and move the days around. Like I said, the split is going to be very individual. I've ran through a ton of different splits in my own training, and it's something that I do mess around with quite often just because it can have quite a big effect on performance. I know having this SBD day here on a Saturday is quite popular at the minute and something that a lot of people are doing. I do think SBD days can be useful for powerlifters. It really just depends on the context and what you really need from it. So in my experience, some lifters do very, very well with having an SBD day just because it really, it kind of prepares them obviously for the demands of competition day. It gets them used to the whole process. It maybe reduces some nerves and anxiety about going in and competing all 3 lifts on one day. But then I've found that other clients I've worked with put way too much priority on this SBD day, ends up taking them 4 hours, and it just turns into more of a performance and a really fatiguing thing rather than productive training. So just depends on the athlete's personality. So that's something else you can play around with as well. But I definitely don't think SBD days are essential. I have loads of clients who have never done an SBD day in their programming, and they're doing just fine. Realistically, I do think people exaggerate a little bit kind of the demands of a competition day if you haven't been doing SBD days, because realistically we are only doing 3 lifts per exercise on a competition day, and I know it can be fatiguing, you don't feel great afterwards, but you don't necessarily always have to do that SBD day to prepare for it, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is, I would say, the more simple component of programming is finding out the split, because realistically there is no right or wrong split, just as long as you come up with something that fits your schedule, allows you to perform on the days you need to perform. But once you've got this, that's where things start to get a little bit more complicated. So once I've got this split and I know which days the client's going to be training, that's when I start to come up with the actual protocols for the lifts. So like the volume, the intensity, how many sets and reps they're going to be doing, what weight they're going to be using. And again, that's very dependent on the individual. So I need to see previous training to kind of determine that how much work the person needs to do to make progress. I do have some kind of defaults that I usually work from and then adjust based on the individual. So my preferred approach, and I think it's probably better that I go over this in a part 2, the actual like volumes and intensities that I'm going to use. But my default is usually on squat 1, deadlift 1 and bench 1, the priority lifts. So these would be the competition lifts. I usually have people work up to some kind of top set or benchmarking set, whatever you want to call it. So that set is the priority of the day. It's to give them some exposure to heavier weights at lower velocities, and we kind of use that top set to determine performance on a given day. So it gives us an idea of the person's estimated 1 rep max, and then we can kind of base intensity off of that performance. So usually some kind of top set, and that will be typically in the 1 to 5 rep range. I'll usually go towards slightly higher reps in the off season or further away from competition, and then as we get closer to competition, that's when you might see singles or your common like 1 at RP 8 kind of thing. But again, those top sets depend massively on the individual, and I'll go over that in a part 2 of this video. For the rest of the lifts, kind of you'll see they're numbered. So obviously bench 2, bench 3, that should have been bench 4 there. Yeah, so these numbers kind of indicate the priority of the lift. So bench 1 would be a competition bench. Bench 2 might be something that is of a similar priority but slightly lighter weights, and then a bench 4 would be something that is even less priority or a lighter variation. So that might be like a Larson press, feet up bench, close grip, something like that. And I think it's a good idea to kind of prioritize your lifts a little bit through the week, and I got that idea from Joey Flex a little bit, so with numbering the variations. I think just even psychologically going into the sessions knowing that not every session is a like priority 1 lift, and you know on some days you need to perform and other days you can kind of pull back and leave a little bit in the tank, and I think it's a good way to manage fatigue as well. But yeah, so we got the split. That's when I start to look at volume and intensity. Like I said, that can be a fairly in-depth process that takes a little bit of time, a little bit of experimentation. One piece of advice I will give is I think it's always a good idea to start on the lower end and have the client do less rather than more, because you can always add sets, add training volume, make things more difficult, but it can be a little bit more difficult to start stripping things off, and that's when you run into to problems of how much to take away, what do you need to change. So I like to have clients start easy and then we can add work over time, and I think that gives them the chance to build some momentum going into the training block. But yeah, that kind of overviews the process of how I go about designing a first draft of a training program. So usually I'll follow this process. I come up with some kind of draft. I then send that over to the client and we jump on a call. We usually discuss things. We end up tweaking things, moving things around. Then I'll have them run 1 or 2 introductory weeks. So those intro weeks essentially will be kind of reduced workloads, lower volumes and intensities, and we'll give the client a chance to adapt to the workload, to experiment with the exercises and kind of decide on exercise selection before we really get into the meat of the block. So at that point the client's good to go, and that's when we can start to collect data over time and really adjust things based on how they respond. Next time I'll go into a bit more detail on how I actually set up volume, intensity, exercise variations and things like that as well. If you have any questions about this process, just the initial setup, determining frequency, the split and things like that, then post them in the comment section down below and I'll get back to you. If you want to see more training and nutrition related information, then go ahead and follow me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Now I'll be putting out weekly uploads every single Saturday it should be, so keep an eye out for that. I'll put a link in the description down below to all the social media platforms and things like that. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll be coming out with a part 2 pretty soon.